Good morning. It is Wednesday, July 3rd, 2024, the day before July 4th. You're listening to the RED-C Roundup. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Deacon Mike Beauvais. Today, as always, we have a great show for you. We may not have fireworks, but we have an interesting topic. I will be talking to Dr. Pavlos Papadopoulos, and he teaches at Wyoming Catholic College. He's a native of New England, and he's been moving south ever since to get his education, and now he's back up in Wyoming. He got his liberal education at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, and this is where he first encountered the great books. Then he moved on to the University of Dallas, where he received his doctorate in political philosophy. And I want to welcome you to the show, Professor. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you so much for having me on. Great to join you.
My pleasure. I thought since we do have the 4th of July coming up this week, that talking a little bit about politics won't hurt, especially from a Catholic perspective.
And especially in such a crazy political year as this one.
Oh, yes. I don't think I have ever seen anything as fascinating to me in the political realm than right now. We've always thought that politics was a little insane, but it's managed to top it this year. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and especially in contrast to what the early understanding of the Republic in the United States really was, and how we've seen it in relationship to some of the theories of Plato from 2,500 years ago, and de Tocqueville when he first came up and saw the democracy here and his impression of it. But before we get into this, would you talk a little bit about your faith experience growing up?
Sure. I should talk about my lack of faith experience growing up, because although my name might make it sound like I come from a big fat Greek family with a lot of Greek orthodoxy involved in it, I actually was raised in a totally secular, liberal, non-religious environment, and so I didn't have the faith growing up. I wasn't baptized until I myself entered the church when I was a graduate student. I grew up in Massachusetts in a culture and a family that had lost touch with faith or any kind of church, and it took me a long time after having gone to college at St. John's, as you mentioned. I read the great books that were studied there. I began to realize that there was a deep and profound world of questions and a variety of answers out there that I hadn't been introduced to when I was young. And I went home after college with the bad habit of asking lots of questions about why we should or should not believe something. That started to get me into trouble when I turned my questioning towards all kinds of hot button political issues. And I eventually made my way to the University of Dallas, which is, as you may know, a Catholic university in Irving, Texas, right outside DFW. And I went there to continue to study the great books, and especially political philosophy. But I also found there that it was a great Catholic community, and I got to know a lot of intelligent and faithful Catholics in my time there. And I realized over the course of my studies there, and as I began to teach, that I needed to take seriously the claims on the human person that are made by the Catholic Church. And I spent the first few decades of my life not realizing that there were serious questions involved in that. And so in my time in graduate school, I started to realize that the church had very profound and perhaps correct answers to questions about the nature of the human person, the nature of God, the nature of the world, how we ought to relate to one another and to our own being and to our Creator. And so that began my process of conversion. And I entered the church and got married all in a great, wonderful whirlwind a number of years ago, and am now blessed to have a number of children and a wonderful wife here out in Wyoming.
I find this so fascinating because you went the opposite direction of the way we see this happening normally. Young people get raised in the church and they hit college, and I think in a way they stop asking those important questions, and that leads them away from the church. And in your case, of course, it went the opposite direction. Your curiosity led you in that direction. So I find it interesting. Was it really just seeking those answers that ultimately led you in that direction?
Not just, but it was a large part of it. I mean, we can't discount the power of example. And I was just very fortunate. I can say now it was providential. At the time, I would have said it was just good luck. But I was very fortunate to have a number of good examples around me in those years when I was able to start asking these great and disturbing questions about the nature of reality and my own existence. And so as I was in the intellectual community of the university, I realized that these very intelligent interlocutors I had and fellow graduate students and professors, many of them took their faith very seriously. And so it became intellectually interesting to me and compelling to me to seek out what it was that they took seriously. At the same time, I fell in love with my now wife. And so as I got more interested in her, I realized I want to understand what makes her tick. And it turns out that she believes in all of these things that the Catholic Church teaches, and she goes to Mass and so on. And so I got interested in that. But the power of example, not just on the intellectual side, but in terms of how we live our life, was very powerful for me as well. My own family growing up was broken. My parents got divorced. I know a lot of people growing up, or relatives who live in broken houses or came from broken families. And I was very fortunate to come to know my now in-laws, my wife's siblings who are living nearby. And as I was dating and then engaged to my wife, to get to know their home life and to see a sort of beautiful, rich, faithful, and just happy home life with lots of kids, a happy marriage, and a great deal of exuberance and joy involved in the way they lived. And that was such a stark contrast to the caricature of faith in general and then Christianity and Catholicism in particular that I had growing up, that it shocked me, and it made me realize if I've just come from a world of disorder that is also very proud of not taking all of these things on faith and not going in for all the superstition of the Catholic faith. If that world is correlated with disorder, and this other world of the faith and religion and family is correlated with good order and happiness and all of these things that I had found lacking in my own upbringing, maybe I should take seriously the claims of the church. And so it was certainly partially intellectual, but it was also seeing the goodness of the way of life of the people who took these things seriously and tried to live by them. And finally, it was really the beauty of beginning to attend the Mass and participating eventually in the liturgy of the Catholic Church that drew me in. And so these, I don't know, maybe it happens on one track for other people, but for me, it wound up calling on all of those different levels of wanting to live a well-ordered and happy life, of wanting to know the truth about things, and also being attracted to the beauty of the celebration of our Lord's sacrifice.
On the intellectual side of things, you had mentioned reading the great classics, and this guiding you towards realizing there's important questions to ask. And speak a little bit about the importance of some of these classical works in guiding us towards these important questions in life and addressing them.
Sure. I'll begin just with philosophers and leave explicitly theological discussions out of it for now. Aristotle and René Descartes. Aristotle, maybe the greatest Greek philosopher of Greek antiquity before Christ, and René Descartes, considered the founder of modern philosophy by many. They have radically different approaches to understanding what the things are around us in the world, how to understand what a thing is, and how to understand what a human being is. And to put it as simply as possible, for Aristotle, he looks at human beings and he thinks of us as an integrated whole between body and soul. We have our souls. They are sort of infusing our bodies with purpose. It's what enables us to be alive and to live and to move about the world and to receive information from the world and so on. And when we speak of what a person is, we cannot say that person is simply his body or simply his soul. We don't, for Aristotle, you have to have the both together, and one separated from the other isn't the whole human person. For René Descartes, the great modern philosopher, he is famous for Cartesian dualism. Dualism just here meaning the radical separation of body, of things that have extension in the world, from mind or maybe soul, and consciousness. And Descartes really sets the way that we think about things, including ourselves today, in common culture, unfortunately, which is that there is this radical separation between my body and myself, that my body is a kind of machine that I happen to inhabit and that I can manipulate as I wish, so that my self, my true self, my mind or my consciousness can be more pleased with it, instead of seeing it as an integrated part of myself that I have received as a gift and that is closely related to myself. And so, having encountered these kinds of arguments through the classics, I realized eventually what's very obvious, which is that they can't both be right, and I have to discern which one is more accurate than the other. And in that process of exploration, I also came to realize that the kinds of things that the Bible and church tradition and the Catholic Church teaches are much more in line with the Aristotelian view that we are integrated wholes of body and soul together, that what we do with our bodies and what we do with our souls matter and influence one another, and that both together are a gift to us from someone, from something, as opposed to the Cartesian understanding, which is really manifest in a radical way today with movements such as transgenderism. There are much more mild versions of this, of, you can just decorate your body with tattoos all over and sort of make it a canvas for your own creative self. And whatever you think about that, it's not nearly as extreme an interpretation of the mind's relation to the body as transgenderism, which says that I, the sovereign self, who is just a mind but can exercise influence over the material world, should have the right and maybe even the duty to manipulate the body that I have to better suit my ideas of who or what I think I am. And I, having just looked around me at the way that other people were living and thinking, I realized that modern Cartesian understanding of a radical dualism between body and mind, there were an awful lot of people trying to live that way, and they didn't seem to be very happy. So that seemed to be a clue that was not the right way to think about what kind of person, what it means to be a person, what I am, and what the people around me are.
I find it fascinating that the Catholic Church, especially since Thomas Aquinas, has moved so much towards that, well, explained better the Aristotelian understanding of the unit of the body and soul, that you can't separate them as far as the human person is concerned, that one influences the other, and it's basically one. And I think in one way, this is why the church is struggling so much today to communicate with the world around us, because that view has been so rejected, because it's, I can do with my body what I want and it doesn't influence my soul. And I think that's a challenge for the church to speak, because Descartes has been so influential on humanism in the world we live in today.
That's absolutely right. And that view that I ascribe to Aristotle, of course, isn't only his. It's got powerful resonance with Scripture itself.
Right.
And so does the temptation in the direction of becoming gods, right? We are given a body that is infused with soul, and Scripture tells us this very directly in Genesis. And at the same time, it also warns us about the temptation to act as gods who can recreate our own selves in the world around us in a radical way. And so Scripture itself has seen these two sides from the very beginning, and the philosophers are sort of trying to make their way in a coherent way towards one view or the other.
Now, your degree is in political philosophy. So for our listeners, would you explain what exactly political philosophy addresses?
It might sound like a paradox, right? Because what's less philosophical than politics? That's the way we normally think about it. But political philosophy is the philosophic investigation of politics. And so the main questions it asks are first a set of ethical questions, the most important one being what's the best way of life for human beings? What does it really mean to be happy and fulfilled according to the nature we have? And how should we live in light of that fulfillment that we're aiming for? And more centrally and more properly politically, what would it look like to set up society and set up a system of government and live in community in a way that reflects that vision of the best life? And so and then there's all kinds of subordinate questions about law and about systems within government and mechanisms that might incline your political regime, your form of government, towards one direction, one vision of a way of life or another. But that's the core of political philosophy, is asking what's the best way of life for humans, and how should government, how should society be structured in light of that way of life. And when you start looking at the history of political philosophy, you find a range of answers to what the best way of life is, and therefore a range of different recommendations about what form of government is going to be best. There's also additional subordinate questions that are very interesting, such as, even if you've discovered what in theory is the best form of government, what about in this situation? What kind of advice could Aristotle or Plato or whomever give given that you have these kinds of limits and parameters put on your nation, given the place and time that you live in? And so it's a branch of philosophy, but it's very practically oriented, and it's aimed at clarifying for citizens and for statesmen what they ought to be aiming at in their political activity, how they might move their own nation towards a more virtuous arrangement of politics that's conducive to the good life, rightly understood.
Now, the United States is a democratic republic. And in view of some of the early writers, especially at the beginning of this country, the idea was that this was the best form of government if you were looking for both a religious moral ground and a political moral ground, because it's based on that religious view. And for instance, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America in a very positive light. Would you touch a little bit on that, what his viewpoint was and what he saw in our government?
Sure. So Alexis de Tocqueville is a French nobleman or aristocrat living a generation and a half after the French Revolution. So an aristocrat from an old French noble family who comes to the United States in 1830 to visit America and to see what America is all about, to see what the democratic era that the whole world has started to enter is all about, and how it's playing out in America. And it's important to remember that he's coming from France, and that he has the contrast between France and America and the French Revolution and the American Revolution in mind. Because what de Tocqueville himself saw was, in his own family's history, he had a great uncle or something like that who was sent to the guillotine. He saw and experienced the trauma of the French Revolution within his own family. And he saw the great upheaval and ups and downs of the revolution, of the terror, of Napoleon, of the Restoration, of the New Republic, and so on, in French history. And so democracy had entered France at the end of the 18th century, very soon after the American Revolution, but it had done so in a clearly distinct way than it had in America. And so de Tocqueville wanted to understand what the virtues and vices of a democratic society were, and to see how America sort of struck that balance in contrast to how France did. And he noticed a number of really remarkable things. And when you go and read his work, Democracy in America, there are many through lines from 1830 now to 2024 that make it sound like he's still describing the same society. He talks about how Americans are really a assertive and self-organizing people. Americans have a kind of genius for what he calls voluntary associations. They form clubs. They take it upon themselves on the neighborhood level or on the local level to take care of problems. They don't just sit around and wait for the central federal authority to send an expert to solve their problems, but they actually take it upon themselves just to solve their local problems. And as you mentioned, Tocqueville also paid a lot of attention to the religious character of the Americans. He said that one of the most remarkable things about the American Republic was that the Americans understood and combined the spirit of liberty with the spirit of religion. And this was remarkable to a Frenchman in the 19th century, where in Europe, the debate always seemed to be either liberty with atheism or religion with throne and altar, or, at its worst, some form of despotism, but not Republican self-government. And so Tocqueville's very interested in the Puritan role in New England in founding America, in the role of, in the recognitions that Americans had of how the moral teachings of Christianity, including Catholicism, which he talks about a few times, but largely Protestantism in this largely Protestant nation, the moral teachings of Christianity tend to complement the requirements of a free, self-governing political order. And so Tocqueville is an observer of America from the outside who notices that the Americans understand and practice the complementarity between religiously infused and religiously supported morality and self-government, that we can't disentangle the moral character and the religious character of a people from their religious beliefs and from their capacity for political self-government, that politics and morality and even religion must cooperate together if we are to have a flourishing and free society which will respect the dignity of the human person, expressed in religious belief and practice, but also expressed in their free association and free initiative in society.
Now, my interesting question would be, were de Tocqueville alive today and saw the way that that form of government is lived out in our culture today, would he recognize it?
Yes and no. And that's a wonderful question. And that's the exact question I have every time I read and teach de Tocqueville. Conveniently for us, he wrote another book called The Old Regime and the Revolution, which was really focused on France. And what he does in that work is he describes the lead up to the French Revolution and how under the French monarchy, there had been such a centralization of authority in Versailles, at the royal court at Versailles, and such a evacuation of liberty and self-government from the local feudal institutions in France, that in the run-up to the French Revolution, France had really prepared itself for the revolution by destroying the decentralized, what we would call proper subsidiarity of the old French regime. And so that's helpful for us Americans of the 21st century to look at, because we might actually resemble more closely the regime of France at the time that de Tocqueville was writing, which is to say a centralized authority, a giant, what we now call maybe the swamp or the Leviathan state or the administrative state, which has aspired to centralize all decision-making in the expert class in a central location. And in so doing has really weakened the capacity of local communities to decide for themselves, has weakened the capacity of civil society, of charities, of local churches, of just fraternal organizations and neighborhoods to care for themselves and to take initiative on their own. And so that get her done, do it yourself character of Americans that was so strong in the 1830s is still with us to some extent. And it's certainly with us to a greater extent in certain parts of the country than in others. But that has been partially evacuated and overlaid by an attempt, especially in the last century and increasingly in recent decades, to take self-government and self-rule away from the people and away from local and small societies, small communities, civil society, churches, and so on, and to instead arrogate all of that decision-making power to bureaucrats, to the experts who have been properly trained in the relevant sciences at universities, and then who are staffing the administrative agencies, usually in DC, and who, in their own understanding, can look at all of the data and all of the studies and adjust all of the interests and make all of the important decisions for us ordinary Americans who don't know any better. So there are elements that are still recognizable in the character of the American people, but we have gone very far down a path that Tocqueville was worried about and that he warned us against, which is that we prefer a kind of, so-called just equality of outcomes to the freedom to decide for ourselves and the freedom to make the attempt ourselves. And we have, in a large part, slid from that virtuous democratic society that he recognized to a much more despotic democratic society that he saw in the Russia of his time, that he saw France tending towards, and that he feared America would tend towards as well.
And I think this is important to note, is that America was never intended to be a pure democracy. It was always intended to be a republican democracy, where you do have the dispension of authority. You had the states were basically an authority that had a central government that helped to intermediate between them, rather than having a centralized government, which we now have. And now the idea of republic is way older than the United States. Plato wrote the Republic. And would you talk a little bit about Plato's idea, what that should look like?
Sure. Plato is going to be useful for us in certain ways, but what he calls a republic, the title of his great dialogue, The Republic, is not quite the same as what Madison and Hamilton and the founders understood by that term. So Plato's dialogue, The Republic, the Greek title is Politeia, which is best translated as regime or constitution or form of government. And so Plato describes in that dialogue, which is a long conversation about justice, what justice is, what justice looks like in an individual soul, and by analogy, what justice looks like in a whole society, in a city. In that work, Plato's characters, Socrates and these other men that Socrates is talking to, describe a number of different ways of arranging the order within one's own soul, the regime or constitution of your own soul, and correspondingly the order or regime within a society. And they describe an aristocracy, which is literally, it means the rule of the best, in which all of the parts of your soul, the part that's interested in intellectual things, the part that is spirited and sort of full of righteous indignation, or even the will, and then the desiring part. The aristocratic soul is one in which all of these parts are properly ordered so that each part may do its proper work well. Our desires are rightly ordered so that we experience desire for things that we should, and therefore satisfy the needs that we genuinely and naturally have. Our spiritedness helps keep our desires in check, and serves at the beck and call of our reason. And our reason is free from the passions, to be able to direct the passions, and also to direct the whole human person towards the highest goods, which for Plato is the good, wisdom, understanding, and sort of the practice of philosophy. And so that is the ideal type. That's the best type of soul, according to Plato's Republic. And there's a city that corresponds to that. And this is where Plato's famous idea of philosopher kings, the equivalent to the intellectual part of the soul, are ruling over the soldiering class, who in turn are sort of keeping the many people who are doing everything else in check, and also protecting them as sheepdogs protect a flock of sheep from the wolves outside of the pack. And Plato has a wonderful account of how that best form of the individual soul and the best city degrades into lower forms. And from the rule of reason, next we have what he calls a timocracy, which is the rule of the honor-loving part. And that's where you have a soldiering class dominating everything and setting policy in the individual soul or a city. Below that is oligarchy, just the pursuit of wealth for its own sake. There's nothing wrong with wealth in Plato's view, or wrong with military victory, but if they become unmoored from higher goods, then you run into some real problems. Below that for Plato, below oligarchy, is democracy. It's actually the second worst, and below that is tyranny. And so for democracy in Plato's account, it's really a kind of form of anarchy where there is no principle of rule. There's no principle of deciding why you should do one thing rather than another. And so in Plato's conception, the person with a democratic soul will just sample a little bit of everything. He'll sort of move from one taste, one pleasure, one interest, one hobby to another. He's like the man who makes a New Year's resolution every year and keeps it for a week or two and then sort of falls off the wagon again and starts trying something else. And at a societal level, what a democracy looks like for Plato is the rule of just many people who are not disciplined in themselves and don't have any sense of a proper order or hierarchy of their own interests, of the things they ought to love. And so a society that flits from one interest and ultimately one pleasure to another. And that, in Plato's view, is on a slippery slope towards tyranny, which is being entirely dominated by the most powerful desires and passions that you could possibly possess. And Plato speaks of those as especially sexual passions, but also passions that are just unlawful, that are by their nature shameful. And so Plato had quite a skeptical view of democracy, as you can just see. It's the second worst form of government in that scheme. When we finally come to the American founders, they had that in mind, or something like that in mind, when they were leery of pure democracy, because they did not trust untutored human nature without any sense of discipline and order, even imposed from one's own self, to manage individual life or collective communal life well. And so when they set up a republic, part of what they wanted to do was find a way of allowing the proper expression of liberty to persons, to families, to local communities, but also to guard against the natural human temptation to degrade to a sort of lower level. And so a republic in their conception is constrained by a constitution. So it's a constitutional republic. We formulated our representatives, the Constitutional Convention, and in the various states, formulated a constitution that would set a bound on what the people and their representatives could subsequently do. So we judge the laws of Congress by the Constitution, not vice versa. And we justify this in the American context because we can see that the founders deliberated, had the time and space during that hot summer in Philadelphia to deliberate on what a proper system of government ought to be. And it takes quite a bit of effort and time and persuasion to persuade enough people to pass a constitutional amendment, for example. And so by its very mechanism, the slow and deliberately inefficient character of creating the Constitution and then of amending the Constitution forces us to have a greater degree of deliberation, of cool-headedness, of thought, of conversation with others, and of genuine acts of persuasion to get a constitution in place and to amend a constitution. That's much more deliberation and therefore a greater role for reason involved than any given piece of legislation which is passed in the heat of an election year in the run-up to some great event and to get your constituents to re-elect you or something like that. And so there are certain mechanisms, I've just mentioned one of them, but there are many others that the founders tried to build into our form of government and our society that would check the impulsiveness of what Plato would call the democratic soul, and as a result, try to create space for reason to exercise some influence in political affairs as we make our political deliberations.
Now, there's one point of agreement that I see between Plato's The Republic and the Founding Fathers, and that is the acknowledgement that in order for a government to work, there has to be a consensus of an objective good. Mm-hmm. That we know what good is in order for us to seek it. And the founders of the United States knew that the Christian Judeo-ethic was that basis, that we could build on that, whereas Plato just said there is a good and we're striving for it. But that agreement that you have to have an understanding of good in order for it to work, we sort of jettisoned that also.
That's right, and we're paying the price for it right now. And the founders, right, left space for this public acknowledgement of, well, they to some extent practice that public acknowledgement of Christianity in their Thanksgiving proclamations and so on, even in the Declaration of Independence. But this is largely the affairs of the states and the local communities. And so I completely agree with you on this. It's just important to note one of the reasons we don't always see this as explicitly as we might expect in the Constitution or the Federalist Papers is because those are federal documents, and our federal regime builds in an understanding that these things are going to be pursued in somewhat different ways in Texas versus in Massachusetts or Virginia or Wyoming or wherever. And so they fully expected that a necessary condition for our constitutional regime working would be a flourishing religious and moral life at the local and state level. And they have some very dire things to say about their own expectations of what would happen to the American regime if we disregarded that notion of the objective good and if we disregarded Christianity specifically.
Professor Papadopoulos, we're down to 5 minutes, and I would love to talk about this a little bit longer, but I have a question totally unrelated to this. And you teach at Wyoming Catholic College.
I do.
And one thing of note about Wyoming Catholic College is you have a tech policy that's different from almost every other university or college I know of.
Yes.
Would you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I don't think this is completely unrelated, actually. I think it's very closely related. So our students, when they come to study for their 4-year Bachelor of Arts and Liberal Arts degree, it's a classical Catholic liberal arts college here. When they come here, they give up their cell phones, and that's one of the things we're most famous for. And they adhere to a broader technology policy, which is to say there are restrictions on use of internet in dorms. There are deliberate ways in the way that we craft our community to limit screen time, to not need to be on your device all the time. And we do this, I think, for very good reasons. The first is that we've noticed that cell phones in particular, but screen time in general, and this is what many people have noticed, it acts almost like an acid on people, including on young people. It leads them to be distracted, even before you get into questions of pornography or something like that. It just draws you away from the real world and the people in front of you. And so it's not conducive to good community to have a lot of young people addicted to their devices. And it's also not conducive to study. It's not conducive to not only making friends and study, but experiencing God's creation, the natural world that's all around us. And it's not conducive to prayer. And so for all of those reasons, we limit our students' usage of technological devices. They all know this coming in. They can check out their cell phone if they're, when they're going home for break or something like that, but they give them up or leave them somewhere throughout their time here at Wyoming Catholic, precisely so that they can be liberated from the distractions and the kind of reductive character of the screen, so that they're freed to form good friendships, to pay attention to their studies and really sink into a state of leisured contemplation of the things we're asking them to study, so that they can go out and enjoy the beauty of the mountains that we're surrounded by and go out into the outdoors. And maybe most importantly, so that they can actually practice prayer, participate in Mass and liturgy, and grow closer to God.
I find it fascinating. Now, what kind of feedback have you gotten on this from the students?
Largely positive, I think overwhelmingly positive. It's occasionally annoying because these devices are good for something. They're convenient. Right. We're conversing right now via our computers. But I have had so many experiences of students coming to our summer programs as high schoolers. We have a summer program where students can experience our community for a few weeks if they're considering applying. And many students then tell me that they apply to the college, they come to the college because that was their first experience of true and free community with their peers, because this generation has grown up with cell phones almost from birth in some cases. And so they're very enthusiastic about the freedom that it gives to them, the fact that they're able to form more profound connections here with people looking at each other eye to eye instead of just communicating through their phones than they might at home with people who aren't living with this kind of policy. And I think they're really liberated to be themselves and to discover the beauty of the world and the grandeur of everything that God has given to us through other persons and through the created world.
We're down to a minute, and I really wanted to say thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation, and there's several questions I never got a chance to ask, so hopefully we can do this again sometime. And we're about to celebrate the 4th of July, and there is a lot of things to celebrate because we are still living in the United States of America, and the potential for greatness is still there. So I hope all our listeners paid close attention to this. I hope everybody will have a wonderful 4th of July, and we're going to have a second portion to the show, and I hope everybody will stay with us through the break. Dr. Was a pleasure to have you, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you so much. God bless.
God bless you.